So Gracia just started recording. So welcome to the session today, which is on open results with expert Aman. If you could please add your names on the Framer pad in the roll call, and if you could please indicate with a W or an S if you would prefer to be assigned to a breakout room where you speak or where you communicate in writing. So that's, thanks Lillian. That's on line 14 of the Framer pad. And as I'm sure you know by now, there's a code of conduct applying to this call. So please participate, and please participate in a considerate and respectful way, keeping in mind that not everybody is communicating in their primary language. And if there is any issues, the Framer pad is telling you who to contact. Okay. I'm enjoying seeing the songs. I'm going to look them up after the session. Okay. I think we still have a few people that need to put out their names. Okay. More people trickling in. Okay. Should we maybe get started, Aman? And people can keep on adding their preferences for the breaking rooms and their songs as you start. So if you could please introduce yourself and then take it away. The links to the slide is on the Framer pad as well, and I'll put it in the chat.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, I think I've just added the link to the Zenodo as well. I'll add it to the slides. It's not published on OLS yet, but I think people should still be able to access it. Let me just quickly find my tabs. There are too many, as always. I think there are a couple of folks joining as well.
Yes.
I'm just admitted.
Adding them. Yeah.
And yeah, should I start sharing my screen?
Yes, that would be great.
Perfect. I think it might take over from your screen.
Yeah, I'm just stopping. Here we go.
Great. Okay, so is this visible? Are you able to see my screen?
I can't. Do other people? Oh, apparently everyone else can, so.
Oh, okay. I'll just retry. Just a second. Okay, share it again.
Perfect. I can see that.
Amazing.
Take it away.
Okay. Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us today. And as Elsa did the very kind introduction, it sounds a little funny to say expert Aman, where it just like sounds like an adjective, but I quite like that. But anyway, getting on to our session. So today we're discussing open results. This is the 8th session for this cohort, I think. I hope folks have had a good cohort so far. We'll discuss like a few different things today. Most of the focus would be on open results and contributing to open results. So looking at what are open results, what are the research objects that we use while talking about open results, and how do we sort of navigate those research objects. There's information in the chat, by the way. There's a Framer pad, so please feel free to just access, like look at the Framer pad and add your thoughts, add your questions, if any. I'll make sure that we sort of stop every now and then and I'll check in with folks if they have anything to add, any questions, but we'll also have some time for breakout rooms. So without further ado, I'll just sort of get started with the overall concept. Just a quick note that, yeah, because this can be a bit technical, please do interrupt me if you'd like me to sort of explain something or elaborate on something more. And if there's anything, again, like if you have any doubts or even just, yeah, any examples, you're more than welcome to just jump in. But starting with open results, I think the first thing we want to look at are research objects. So research objects are essentially these sort of these methods that we sort of define. So I'll first read out the actual definition where we define a research object as a method for identification, aggregation, and exchange of scholarly information on the web. Now, what this essentially means is just looking at the research life cycle that we have and looking at the different sort of objects that might be used throughout that research life cycle. So, for example, if we think of a more tradition in a more traditional way, if you write, say, a book or a guide about, say, some scientific process where uh, say an example could be a journal of philosophy in back in the 1600s, or then it could be, say, you'll have like the physical journals back in the day where you're doing your scientific research and you publish them as sort of a physical book. That's your journal, that's your research object. But that sort of creates this result as sort of the research process goes through. And then I think in the 20th century, we started moving more towards research journals. So the conference proceedings, the books that we know of now, they came, I think, in late 1940s. And now in 21st century, we have a lot of different sort of research objects and research results that we look at. So, for example, if you look at, say, any result during a research process, it's not just the final published paper you're releasing. It can be the blog post that is associated with it. It can be the code of conduct that you develop for it. So essentially, like all these different bits and pieces that are involved within the research life cycle, they would be defined as the research objects. So that's just sort of a quick overview of what, say, research objects look like. Now, the traditional sort of definition has changed over time, but this is the more official definition that has been adopted in the scientific community. So this definition was given to us by, I think, a 2019 research paper, which defines the research object as a method for identification, aggregation, and exchange. Now, they can be composed of both research data and digital research objects. So if we look at our research life cycle, this again is just sort of one example of a research life cycle where it's sort of linear in this diagram itself, in this depiction, but it does not have to be linear by default, where there can be quite a few different ways to look at this. So here we're looking at just the more uh, standard way of, say, looking at a research life cycle, where you start from ideation and proposals, where, okay, you're planning some research and you have some kind of uh, overall plan where you'll start with, say, planning about your data, then planning about your project in general, just figuring out, okay, what goes where, how do you sort of start with the project. Then you come to the training and the tutorial and the guidelines where it might involve, say, documentation. It might involve the different sort of aspects of getting up to date with the project itself. Then, say, after that, engagement and training is done, you might go into data collection, then data wrangling, data exploration. So again, these all of these steps might not be necessary for every research life cycle. So everyone has sort of a different way of conducting research. It depends on if you're doing, say, qualitative research, if you're doing quantitative research, if it is like a formal method itself. So informally, I would say, like, yeah, I think data collection might be a very standard thing that people do across fields. So data collection does not necessarily have to look like the formal data collection. It could just be sort of you trying to sort of navigate the, I guess, the sample set you're working on, the kind of sort of subjects that are affected by that research life cycle, or just yeah, general data that you might need for the process itself. So it can be related to the research, related to the research process. Then again, you sort of do the data wrangling, which is basically changing the form of that data, working with that data to get something out of it, and then you do some exploration. So basically, in the overall research process, we go through a few different steps. And towards the end, usually, say, we might have a report or a publication or an article, a blog, a video, something that you have as an output. Now, the one important thing to keep in mind here is that open results are not just, say, data or code or like a very specific result, so to say. It can be a lot of the different research objects produced throughout this research life cycle. So when we look at, say, the different uh, stages of the life cycle, we're, say, producing some tutorials, for example, or we're producing some code, we're producing a data management plan, or maybe a code of conduct. So, for example, we are bound by a code of conduct on this call, and you're right in the beginning when we said that, okay, this is the code of conduct expected for this call. That's the OLS code of conduct, and that's the sort of expected way to interact in the community. That itself is a open result, so to say, because that was created when, say, the OLS community was being planned and it has been adopted for like every interaction that people have. But it is still very much a result and not just, say, what comes at the end of a research life cycle. So this diagram again is like kind of a little simplified in the sense of, oh, there are a lot more ways to look at results. But in the traditional sense, we look at towards the end of the life cycle when we have the output. And that's what you might be more familiar with, where the publication can sort of like often seemed as the one result you're getting or the one output you're getting. Now, when we look at open results, they can include both data and code. So examples of open results can include, say, again, as I said, like there could be peer-reviewed articles, which is the more sort of standard, I think, expectation from like a research life cycle, from whatever work you've done, from whatever research has been done, the output you're producing. But then there is the technical reports you might have, a computational notebook you might have used during that process, a code of conduct, a contributor guideline. So all of these things that sort of make the core of a project, where these might just be the guiding principles, these might be sort of the elements of the project that help run the project better itself and not a result of, say, the research you're doing. So, for example, if I am doing some research on equity and diversity in, say, open source, and I want to look at, like, say, some interviews, and I want to have some output of, okay, this is how we see a few different folks approach equity and diversity in open source, or how these maintainers are sort of approaching this particular topic. Now, at the end of that uh, life cycle, at the end of that research project, I might have those interviews and I might have some output from it. But during that process, even if I have a methodology, even if I have some kind of guidelines for, say, interaction, those could also be looked at the result. Then we've got blog posts. We've again, with sort of the increase of use of social media, we've got the different elements of short form videos, podcasts, you have tweets and just social media posts. And then there are the conference presentations and abstracts, the discussions. All of these can essentially be looked at as an open result. So that's sort of the overall definition. Now, before I think we go on to discuss the open results, in fact, let me share the examples and then I think we can have like a couple of minutes for any sort of reflections or questions about the definitions we are sort of looking at today. So as examples, yeah, like a YouTube video could be looked at as an open result where someone is sort of using a YouTube video for communication, for tutorials, for kind of any kind of research they're doing or any kind of uh, result they're producing. Then we have blogs, which is again like a good example of how blogs have been used in the scientific community recently for science communication, for communicating different results or communicating about the research process itself. So blogs might be another way to look at it. Then we have products. So this is an example from the OpenStreetMap product, which is again kind of like the software itself. That is the ultimate result. So all that to say that, yeah, as we look at open results, the definition is quite wide, and it does not necessarily only have to include data. It can include both data and code. It can take a few different forms, and different sort of aspects of the research life cycle can produce different results. But the focus here is that what results are the open results. Now, open results, say, in a research life cycle would be the research objects produced throughout that process. Now, what we are looking at, because this is the context is open science, we look at like how do we open up every part of that life cycle. And I think, yeah, folks might have been talking about the different stages in the other calls, and you'll have more calls to come where people will talk about, oh, how do you look at, say, the open data, if say, or you look at the just yeah, a code of conduct or a README or the different aspects of that. Now, yeah, before we jump into the further sort of theoretical or the definition bits, I'll just pause here to check for questions and thoughts and reflections. If people have any thoughts or any doubts, any examples they'd like to share, please feel free to do so, or even feel free to type in the pad if you'd like to.
Yes, in the pad or in the chat, actually.
And also just to check, like if the overall definitions that we are sort of introducing here, if they make sense, if people can relate to them, or again, if even if it sounds completely alien, please do tell us, because I know it's like a little technical in its definition, but that's why we try to evolve that definition to broaden it and to make sure that the ways that say people are doing research, they can relate to the results they're producing to their own work. You're more than welcome to just unmute or type. I can see questions coming up in the pad. Uh, okay, so I think, yeah, to get into the core discussions, I might wait for the next bit and then we can get to that question. But yeah, if there's anything else, please do add. And of course, like, yeah, please do add your overall questions as well. Right now, we'll try to focus on the definitions of open results and the different types of open results, and then we'll move on to the larger questions.
Oh, there is a question in the pad.
Yeah,
Is
I
that
just
what
saw that.
the one about AI? Is that the
Yeah,
one
yeah,
you're
yeah.
saying to keep for the
So
end, right?
I was thinking, like, yeah, before we start the activity, we can talk about that question, and I'll just sort of move on to the next bit. But uh, yeah, so since we've talked about open results, now we look at how it looks in practice. Because if our results are open, if our data is open, if our code is open, what it helps us do is create reproducible research. And that's again a concept that you might have come across during this cohort, where reproducibility is a big aspect of open science, where if you can reproduce the research or the results that someone else created or you yourself created, that is the definition, or that is not the definition, that is a good marker of, say, a research life cycle. Now, from the research life cycle, from reproducibility, we also come into reproducibility crisis. So in 2016, I think there was a survey which quoted this statement that more than 70% of researchers tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments, and more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments, which again is kind of a very sort of worrying statement. If you look at those numbers, if you look at the statistics or the survey itself, I think this was about like 1,500 researchers that sort of answered the survey. And this essentially uh, is coined as, say, the reproducibility crisis. Now, the reproducibility crisis in science is just that, yeah, like we are not able to reproduce the research we're doing. And to sort of tackle the reproducibility crisis, we don't just look at, say, the results that we have. We don't just look at the ultimate sort of output that you have from a result, but we look at the entire research workflow. So when we were talking about that workflow from, say, ideation to planning to data wrangling to data collection and then the results, every stage of that research cycle has to be considered if we want to answer or if we want to sort of tackle the reproducibility crisis. And especially if we consider that the, again, reproduction or reproducibility of a scientific method or of a scientific sort of project is also the cornerstone of the scientific method, because we're trying to make sure that whatever we're doing is robust, whatever we're doing can be recreated. And as a core open science principle, we want to make sure that every part of that process is something that someone else can access and recreate. So there is that sort of crisis that has bubbled through when we look at the causes for the reproducibility crisis. The three major causes might be that the intermediate methods of research are often described informally or not at all. So again, going back to the overall sort of life cycle, we look at the different sort of intermediate steps. And in these sort of intermediate steps, if the methods are not defined, or like you're not creating that method in a more descriptive manner, in a way, okay, how this research is done, that can be a cause for the reproducibility crisis, for like stopping people from reproducing your research. Intermediate data is also often omitted. So again, it's not that we only have the data at the end of the result, at the end of the life cycle. There's also data that is produced in the middle of the research or the different stages you take it through. And the third reason that is there is just that a lot of the times we often think about results only at the time of publication. So, from the earlier theme that we were talking about, we don't look at results only at the time of publication. We need to think of the entire research process as a result. And when we sort of put the whole process as a result, we look at the different aspects, the different intermediate methods, and make sure that they're described well, make sure all the data is included, make sure that every step is sort of made in a way that we have all the necessary information for, say, if you were to look at it, say, 2 years later, and you might say not recall from memory, okay, what was done here, you still have those methods describing the intermediate steps, or you have the intermediate data to look at, okay, this is how it looks like after this step, or this is how we started the data, we start with the data, this is the current state, this is the intermediate state. uh, that's like from a more personal example, but then again, it's mostly also about it should be reproducible by anyone else and not just, say, yourself. Now, without sort of looking at the different uh, aspects of a life cycle, so if we say have a research paper which talks about source code, but it does not give us access to the source code, it wouldn't actually help us to, yeah, verify the results or verify what is the methodology of that paper, of that research, or how the outputs were produced. So the reframing we're trying to do here is essentially look at every step of the process. Now, again, before we get into our exercise, I'll stop for a couple of minutes. I'll again open it up to the room if folks have any questions uh, about the reproducibility crisis, any examples or any, again, problems you might be facing. Please feel free to share those. And yeah, any questions, any suggestions, you're more than welcome to. Any reflections. I'll wait a second and then we can take the question and move into our first activity. don't see any questions in the chat or in the Framapad. I'm just looking at a note where someone has pasted an example of a recent work that discusses open research outputs from humanities and social sciences. Oh, that's a great resource. Thank you for sharing that. Uh, yeah, that's very helpful to look at. And yeah, I think Elsa has pasted that in the chat as well. So yeah, that's I think by the UK Research Council, like it's under the UK Research Council. So I think it's talking about the open research output from humanities and social sciences in uh, the UK sort of research space. But yeah, this is a great resource. Thank you. Just looking at the question. So the question we have is AI is now being used on open data and code to try and identify participants across separate studies through analyzing the aggregated results, etc. Are there any guidelines around this, or is it too early? Uh, okay, just to clarify, is this question around like, say, the risk of opening up results or opening up, say, participant information, where I am assuming it's talking about connecting, say, different pseudo-anonymized or anonymized data, but sort of looking at the common patterns to identify the identity of participants. Is it the same thing that this is talking about? I'll just, yeah, wait for, uh, yeah, if the person who asked the question would like to jump in or open up the discussion, please do so.
I think this might have been from Claire.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Question.
So Claire has just typed in the chat. Yes, risk assessment before publishing in any guidelines on strategy. So yeah, I think it's more the latter half that I think it is early, but also like it might not be because if it's happening already, it's just I think something that I haven't sort of looked at or tackled, so I don't have uh, a direct answer for that. But I think yeah, like there definitely probably has to be that consideration now of just looking at the different aspects of open results or the different sort of risk assessment we're doing. So I think one thing that folks often do in the research, especially during ideation and planning, is the open science and data management plan that you might have, or the information and governance review that you might have. And again, a lot of these processes differ in different institutions or different sort of communities. So in the UK research context, you have the IGRR and the DMPs, which are again the uh, information and governance, and then the data management plans. There's also an ethics review. And I think those processes usually are in place to make sure that all that risk assessment is done before publishing and all that sort of information is taken care of. Although I'm not sure if, say, research institutions or teams are looking at sort of updating those guidelines themselves, where if like data management plans or if like even the publication or anonymization, they need to be updated in line with uh yeah, say the current problems that we're facing. Sorry. So I don't have a direct answer. I would think that yeah, like it might be worth looking at how it might change risk assessment if say there's a risk of identifying participants or if there's a risk of that data being misused. That is definitely worth consideration. I do know that, say, depending on the context of the study, so there are the different levels of risk or the different levels of anonymization. Uh, where I'm at the University of Manchester, and I think that's sort of the standard that we have in UK research at least. So if there's say some medical study that is being run by the NHS, the National Health Services here, uh, and it is say being run with participants that is usually just like highly sensitive information, so that kind of information has to be very restricted, and there are like different levels of what information is highly restricted, what information can be anonymized, what information does not need that restriction. And I would think like even with that sort of analysis by, say, new algorithms, we might need to consider, okay, if something needs to be more restricted or more open. But again, I'll open it up to the room as well if anyone else has any thoughts, because I think I was just trying to reflect on what I know about it, but that's not necessarily yeah, the updated way, or there might be better ways to tackle that if people have any reflections. Again, please feel free to just unmute or type in the chat. You're more than welcome to. I'll wait for folks to type in the chat. If there's anything, please feel free to add. Meanwhile, I think we can sort of move to our first exercise, the first activity, where what we're looking at is let's rethink our research workflow and let's identify the research objects that could be or could have been shared as open results of a project that you are or you were involved in the past. Uh, and just thinking of again the entire life cycle, if you think of, okay, what are the high priority items that might help combat this reproducibility crisis in each area of that workflow? So essentially, again, if we look at the research workflow, this is again one example of it where these might be the different stages you're looking at. Now, the activity is essentially asking you to reflect on something you've been involved with or you're currently involved with and rethink the different stages of that where your work, your research objects could have been shared as open results. Uh, I've pasted like the different stages there as well for just reflection. So if folks just sort of discuss this amongst themselves, amongst in the breakout rooms, that I think would be quite helpful. I'm just
Yep.
checking if we want the breakout rooms or if we want to keep it to the main room. But I think it's a big enough group for breakout rooms.
Yeah, they're ready to go. So, are you still
Okay.
happy with 15 minutes for the breakout
Yeah, I
rooms?
think we should be fine. So if we
Great,
say be back by 48, 49, uh, yeah,
great. And if people can report this line 108 on the Framer pad, so each group can share their notes. If you can make sure everyone contributes in the breaking room, that would be great as well.
yeah.
All right, so I'm going to open them now.
Just before people go into the breakout room, yeah,
Mhm.
don't worry about like the technicality. I think this is just more of a reflective exercise. So you can just sort of bring that experience to the room and you can discuss that, but just make sure that, yeah, everyone gets to sort of add the reflections and yeah, don't worry about the exactness or the accuracy of whatever you're reflecting on.
Oh, thanks. All right, let's try this. Okay, you should have got an invite. Right, I think we still have some people in a few rooms
Yeah.
still.
Hi, folks. We'll just wait for everyone to be back in about 15 seconds.
Okay, I think everyone's back. Great.
Okay, that's perfect. Uh, Great. We have everyone back. Thanks, everyone. I hope that was useful. And I think, yeah, we only realized once after creating the breakout rooms that since it's written, I wasn't sure if people were just sort of adding their inputs to the Framapad directly or if they were discussing things in the chat. but I'd be curious to, again, hear from folks if you have any reflections, if you have anything you'd like to share from the breakout room. I'm also looking at the Framapad, and we can discuss those sort of uh, outputs as well, that the things that people have shared on the Framapad itself. But again, please feel free to speak in the room or type in the chat if there's anything in particular that you might have discussed, and it might, if it's not in the Pad, or even if it is, reflections are more than welcome.
Do you want to go maybe one person per room?
Yeah, that'd be
Shares
great. Uh,
from
but I
breakout.
also don't want to put people on the spot
Fair
because I
enough.
know people are typing it out. So yeah, again, one person from each room would be great if we have volunteers, but I'm thinking I'll also just sort of share the screen and read some of the responses in the Framapad, which might also be helpful for everyone else. So let me just quickly share my screen again. Okay, so this is a breakout. This is our Framapad. I hope that's visible.
It is, yes.
Okay, great. So if we look at line 116, I think that's where we're starting the notes. Yeah, I think a lot of folks had different ideas and different sort of ways to approach it. Where if we look at sort of the different stages and the different areas of the research workflow, uh, we're trying to address them. So data wrangling, someone has sharing and tracking code from the beginning, how the source data is structured, and include the metadata, the GitHub tracking. Then for data exploration, documentation has been discussed about. Uh, for engagement and training, it is difficult to genuinely reproduce. Communities are different. Basic approaches can be copied, but the nuances will be community specific, right? It's an interesting point to make. So I think it's also dependent on what we refer to when we're talking about engagement and training in terms of reproducibility. And I think one example of this is, say, we don't necessarily say that, oh, the way a trainer is approaching, say, a session or a course has to be exactly the same. But I think in again, do please do correct me, or if people have any other thoughts to tell me. But from what I'm assuming about engagement training, it is a lot more about, say, the methodology that people are following. So it can be the general philosophy or the general methodology to teach, not to say that, oh, it has to be exactly the same every time, or say the materials we're looking at. So if there are open materials and openly accessible, say, code. Now, one example of this would be Carpentries, this organization that does digital data science and digital practices and computational training. And Carpentries have a lot of different courses. I'll just try to find an example. So software carpentry is an example of this, where we have software carpentry, and let's look at the curriculum. So when we look at the software carpentry curriculum, for example, we're teaching someone programming. The essential sort of information here is that all of this is open sort of coursework. All of the data used is open. All of the methodology used to teach it is pretty open, and it basically recreates itself every time in terms of, if I'm teaching this Python lesson, I would teach it more or less in a similar way to someone teaching it in Australia using the same material and the same methodology. And again, they have like something called the carpentry's instructor training as well, which talks about all the different ways that people would do the instructor, like do the training itself or run the carpentry's workshops. So I think, yeah, if you do a lot of the different aspects of training, which again, I think is different from what when we talk about the training within the, say, research life cycle or the guidelines you might be producing, that might definitely be more difficult to reproduce or different from what this looks like. But just as an example, if anyone else was curious, because that stood out to me, uh, engagement and training, yeah, it is an interesting one, I think, in the ways different projects handle them. Uh, then again, project design might be a good object to reproduce openly, and it helps different teams and even needs collaboration. So yeah, I think those are great responses. And same with like a lot of the other rooms where we look at the data management plans, the code documentation, publishing data dictionaries. So I think, yeah, these are great, I think, points and reflections that people have. Uh, I will give folks again a couple of minutes if there are any points that are particularly, say, that particularly stood out for you or that again raised more questions for you, any clarifications or something new that you might have sort of discovered while making these reflections. Because, for example, we have the negative results, which also someone has mentioned that, oh, negative results are useful to share. We have a hand. Jorley, is it? Sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation.
No, it's all right. It's all right. Is my audio okay? Can you listen to me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I was part of group breakout room 8, and we did have two interesting questions regarding the publication of negative results. And Fotis also raised up a great question regarding the ideation step, because we were thinking that maybe research, we should start publishing the hypothesis creation steps, maybe the methodological step. And he questioned, if publishing the ideation, what exactly would we benefit from this? So we were having this discussion regarding how we would actually share the ideation steps. And since I think it's a bit of, you know, particular to each person, to each team, how do
Mm-hmm.
we share the ideation step?
Okay, I'll first talk about the ideation. I'm not sure if I understood if there was a question on negative results or was that just a reflection?
Yeah,
Uh,
at the end he also made a question regarding the publication of negative results. I think if
mm,
the
right,
the downsides and the upsides of sharing them.
right. Okay, so just to start with the ideation bits, I think again, it's that thing of that it is because research is so subjective and it looks so different for so many different people. It also sort of is that double-edged sword that that ideation might not look similar for everyone. So, as I said, say for example, for training, we are not necessarily talking about reproducing the training itself or like the exact sort of word by word course itself, but to ensure all the methodology around it or all the resources around it are reproducible. I would imagine the same for ideation. So, for example, if there is a project plan that you come up with, or if there are structures that you're using in project ideation, just those might be quite helpful for, say, a future project, or if someone else is trying to look at your research and they look at, say, your hypothesis, they look at, say, the problem statement, and then they try to sort of look at, okay, how did you approach it, or who did you discuss it with? That might give them a better idea about it. There's one of those bits about ideation where again I think it might look different for everyone, where you don't necessarily have to say reproduce or have an open result around say the five different methodologies you were considering and the one you picked, which again could be a valid ideation sort of result. But I think it's mostly about what are the different processes. And an example of this again is like say for a software project or even for like I think research projects, like I have worked with teams where we have say very standard ways of requirement gathering or very standard ways of just even ideating on what solution we will use for this say particular software project. But those sort of scaffoldings where there's a requirements document or there is a project board which guides us through okay which technology we're using, which tool are we using, where are we communicating. So it's not just say the ideation of the research problem, but also the ideation and the of the sort of project and the like project planning essentially. But that's
I see.
one I think thing that comes to mind, if that helps. But I see there's
Yeah,
another
I
hand
think
as well.
yeah, I
Sorry,
think
go on.
Fotis is.
No, I just wanted to thank you for the ideation response first and foremost. And I think your conclusion led to what I was trying to say, that from having something very raw, very informal, when I think of ideation, which could be some note about or an inspiration from listening to something, it's very difficult to, let's say, make that open in the sense that it would make sense. But as you evolved your response, you went into like project planning, and that's where I said the pre-registration element comes as this is what the project is going to be. Of course, you write a bit of an introduction where the motivation comes from, and I think this speaks to the ideation for me that the point is that you don't share that after the project ends, but you share it at the earliest point available, so people know that you're working on it, and therefore you are saving time from others if they want to connect with you, collaborate with you, etc., etc. And about the negative results is a consequence of that, that it detracts from hacking and other kind of things that you can do. When you look at the results, we know this kind of cases where people are encouraged to say positive outcomes, right? This is not their fault, it's how the system celebrates only successes in a certain direction. But research is about negative results as well. And by negative is not a negative connotation, but it's that maybe your hypothesis was not proven, but even that is a result in itself. But right now, the culture does not reward that. So, so I think that's where I mentioned the negative results in that light. That openness in certain elements early of the research, by detracting certain practices, we enable openness in other ways, but we also need the culture to catch up and enable this kind of sharing and make it useful. If it's a result, it's a result. Whether it's positive or negative, we shouldn't judge that, but we should judge the quality of the work. So just my thoughts to put some context on what I wrote. But thank you to Jorli for summarizing this and sharing this in the context of this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are again very important points. And I think that is something to said about, like, say, open science as a structural issue as well, where a lot of the open science principles that we practice, they are sort of very ideal principles, and they might not, say, reflect the same in day-to-day practices, where if you're not rewarded by your institution for, say, publishing in an open journal, you might just not have the incentive. So things like that, as you mentioned, like, yeah, if a negative result is not being given importance, people might feel that. So there is definitely that cultural change. But I think opening up those conversations definitely helps, because a lot of the times people are just not aware that this is an option. So I think when people at least are aware that, okay, these are all the active choices they're making, it makes that choice more intentional, if at all. And just to quickly share, Open Science has this sort of table which talks a lot about these different practices. I've shared that in the Fremapad. I'll tell you which line. So that is right below the prompts on line 101. But here, if we look at the open results, so yeah, when we're talking about, say, the project planning, the proposal, the partnership plans, the ethics approval, these might be, say, the ideation stage and the conceptualization and planning. And then we have the different stages where they've given a few examples of what these open results might look like. But thank you so much for sharing. I think all of these sort of discussions and these results were quite helpful and very, very relevant to what we're talking about. In the interest of time, I'll move on with the slides. But please, again, as I said, feel free to add your reflections and questions in the Zoom chat or in the Fremapad. That would be really helpful. And do let us know if there's anything you have a doubt about or you'd like to clarify. Now, what we'll look at after looking at open results is looking at contributors in open science and the role of contributors in open science. So how we look at, say, open results is just that, oh, we have the different sort of aspects of a research life cycle, and we give people sort of that, yeah, that the different processes for sharing their results at different stages. So we talked about, again, a few different processes there. Folks reflected upon all the different areas where you can have those open results. But then when we look at those results, they bear that responsibility of just like the result on like a few different people. So when we look at, say, the end user of the open results, they would have the responsibility to ensure that the data they reference is used in a responsible manner. But then, say, if someone is a contributor, it's their responsibility to make sure that the data they're sharing is shared responsibly as well, which again, I think kind of brings that question from earlier about if, say, AI algorithms are being used to pinpoint, say, participants across different studies, that would put that responsibility on the researchers as well, on how they approach uh, their research, how they approach their data sharing methods, and if it might, say, have certain risks to share. Now, what we are, I think, interested in is looking at what kind of different contributions that people make. So, how you are contributing to a project and the different ways to provide that contribution. So, on on looking at when we look at open results as a user itself, we should just sort of familiarize ourselves with, say, the contribution guidelines, provide feedback, provide sort of just, yeah, constructive criticism. So looking at the different ways on which in which we can engage with, say, open science and open results as users, as contributors. But then there is also, as authors and as contributors in general of a project, the different responsibilities that we have. So just to define what, say, the different roles we might have in a project, as, say, contributors and authors of the project, is that a contributor is anyone who has done any activity that made it possible for the research to happen and results to be created, published, or shared. And an author, on the other hand, is an author in a form result, is a contributor who has given a substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data or the published work. So those definitions, essentially what they are saying is that, yeah, a contributor would be anyone who is contributing in any manner to a project. It could be big or small, but they are still a contributor to the project to help the research, for helping the research to happen, for the results to be created, published, or shared. But when a contributor is making a significant contribution, you would count them as an author. And again, this might be seen in different contexts. This might be seen in different sort of stages as well, or like what is sort of the project itself. So if it's, say, a research paper, we have very standard, very typical ways of defining a contributor or an author. Uh, if we look at, say, a software project, or if you look at like a project with multiple kinds of outputs, it could be that, oh, we have an author for, say, the communications, the blogs, and the videos. And then we have an author who is publishing the research paper associated. And then we have an author who is working on the software. So you can also have different authors of the project where they might be contributors to another part of the project, but they are author for their own sort of result that they're producing or research object they're producing. So there are a few different ways to look at this, where where we look at contributors, we look at authorship, we look at how we credit people, and how we provide feedback to people as well. Just a general question to the room, and I think we just talked about this: are all authors contributors, and vice versa? Do people have any thoughts, any answers to that in general? Give folks a second if you want to answer in the chat. But just to, yeah, reflect on authorship and contributors.
Is this discussion about also work-like credit and Tenzing's? I know of these two solutions that are trying to, let's say, document as detailed as possible the kind of layers of contribution across different activities, whether it's data curation or conceptualization. I think Tenzing is an inspiration that comes from credit to a certain extent, but credit has, it's an ISO kind of approved standard, and I think it's used a lot. I don't know how automated it is right now for platforms, but certainly it's a useful resource, I think, to start getting to understand a little bit more the layers, the different ways that now people contribute, also in big team projects, right? Because now we have papers written by 20, 30 people, although
Yeah.
still the culture rewards maybe less. When you're part of such a big paper, you get less of a credit, assuming
Yeah.
that your part is smaller. But I think that's where, when it comes to open science, these are a couple of things that come to my mind. Yeah,
I
there are
think
other comments in the
you're
chat.
touching on something which is very sort of important and something we'll also look at, where it is a lot about how we give credit in open science and also changing that de facto, changing that, oh, what has traditionally been, or like even again, like how it is, say, erasing some of the contributions that people might have in different capacities. I'll also share about a couple of projects that are looking at this, where in the UK we have Hidden Ref, which is a project being run by the SSI, the Software Sustainability Institute. That's the institute that I work for. And Hidden Ref is essentially looking at the research excellence framework. So again, for folks who might not be familiar, the REF is this framework in the UK that looks at the academic outputs and contributions. But Hidden Ref is trying to look at all the different kind of outputs that people have and not just research papers. So it would be, as you said, like all the different areas. So if someone is doing some data stewardship, some data wrangling, or someone is building some software or a publication, how do we credit them as well?
There are a couple of comments from Jolie and Claire
Just in the chat, yeah, authors
in
are
the chat. Yeah.
contributors, but I'm not sure about the opposite statement. Contributors are not authors. They may have been a contractor or a member of an organization that provided resources which enable data collection. Okay, yeah, so exactly. So all authors would be contributors, but all contributors won't be authors. So by definition, when we're looking at basically, if we imagine everyone in a project is a contributor, that's the default. But the contributors with, say, significant contributions or the contributors which are sort of involved in the core of the project, they would be seen as authors. So that's basically the relation that, say, contributors and authors have. But when we look at, uh, yeah, the different ways in which we have the contributions, the authorships, we also look at how to give that recognition, which was just brought up in the discussion we were having, where a standalone contribution guideline should be crafted for each project, open project, even when that means reusing an existing draft that the research team has used in another project. So this essentially is just a method of looking at, okay, when we're talking about contribution, when we're talking about authorships, when we're talking about credit, how do we make sure that we uh, ensure that the rules are same for everyone in the community? How do we make sure that our process is open and how we define those contributors and authors? And how do we make sure that the standalone contribution guidelines, they are the ones that are guiding the project and not that, oh, someone is, say, just not given some credit because there is, say, no guideline to back it, or say if someone new is coming to a project, for them to know the expectation that they can have on making a certain kind of contribution, because it might, say, help them get a certain kind of benefit that they might want, or help them contribute in a certain way that would be beneficial for them or like the community in general. So we just look at the general credit giving sort of uh, culture that we have, but also, as has been mentioned, that yeah, that culture is it's being challenged slowly, where people are looking at how results are produced, who produces them, and how do we give credit for those results. So a lot of the times, again, it becomes about if we have an open DOI, if we have all the contributors acknowledged in the different formats, in the different ways they've contributed, that is very useful for people to just sort of, one, get like due credit for their work, but also have just equitable distribution of credit and recognition in the community. Just as we look at contributions, there is another exercise that we will look at where in this exercise, in this activity, we look at an open source project. So you can use any open source project of your choice. We've given sort of a couple of examples. There's the Turing Way, Project Jupyter, and NumPy, where these are projects that that have contribution guidelines or have like, say, examples of how different contributors work in these communities. But you can choose any other project, you can choose your own project, and the activity is just about reflecting on if they have contribution guidelines, would you change anything in those guidelines, or would you use anything from them as an inspiration from the guidelines? So these projects might be helpful to look at when we look at contribution and the different levels of contribution. I think, yeah, we can just sort of do breakout rooms again. And I was thinking 8 to 9 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I put 8 and then more time to discuss. So, all right, sending everyone now.
Great. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat or in the Fremapad. But yeah.
Everyone should be back within like 10 seconds, I guess. Welcome back, everyone. Some thoughts have been shared. I think room 10 had quite a few thoughts about the Turing way. Do you
Hi,
want to have?
folks. Yeah, as mentioned, please feel free to just share your thoughts. If you would like to just, yeah, share them with the room.
So one of the rooms looked at Jupyter, which does have contribution guidelines. Found it was easy to navigate. Turing way, technical instructions, guiding principles, clear sharing and license and reuse license, but a thought about maybe improving the way the website is laid out, so it's a bit nicer to navigate. And
yeah, I think this is very interesting because there's also a lot of, say, new interactions with certain projects because, say, I have interacted with the Turing way quite a lot, so I have certain ways to approach it. But I see what people mean that, oh, it might be, say, a little difficult to go through the click-through pages and navigate that. But just to share the quick examples, so this is the Turing way, and they kind of have the different levels of community contribution and community roles, where they define, okay, who are the authors, the reviewers, the editors, and how people sort of contribute. They also talk about contributing to the project beyond just the book itself, where there are different ways to contribute here. Then they have like a record of contributors, and they have the all contributors page, which again sort of acknowledges everyone who's ever made a contribution in any form. And then we just have sort of like, yeah, the general philosophy they practice around contribution. So yeah, they've got a very detailed process, and I think someone mentioned in the notes as well that they document everything from project ideation dissemination. And again, the Turing way I think is a great example of that project that practices reproducibility at its core, but it is a big open science project and open science community in the first place. So they try to follow their own practices. Now, similarly, there's the hidden ref, which I talked about earlier. I'll paste these links in the chat, but yeah, these are the sort of few sort of things that we're looking at when we look at the different kinds of contributions. In the interest of time, I
Yeah.
know that folks are still typing. I think, yeah, it's great to sort of just look at the contributing guidelines. For questions, should we just discuss them in the room, or do you think we wrap up and I can answer them in the Framapad?
Maybe if you can answer one of them quickly and then
Yeah.
the other on the Framapad.
I think, to be fair, I'm just looking at the questions. Both of them are like big questions, which I might not have the direct answer for. But say, for example, in the second question, there is that thing about scooping with things like pre-registration. And I think that's kind of like that complex topic where I think some studies say that it is more of a common myth rather than actually happening in practice. But then there are places like, say, OSF, which have methodologies like embargoing, I think they call it, where you can protect your sort of data from being public for a certain amount of time, where it is promised to be public, but you are sort of protecting that for a certain amount of time if you feel that you're at the risk of that scooping. Structurally, I'm not sure how sort of common it is, but yeah, like there is the fear of scooping, I think, in the open science communities, which they try to address. So open science framework does a good job, but then there is also just that idea or that sort of myth busting that different sort of institutes do about, okay, scooping does not actually happen structurally, but if it does, like, yeah, how do you look out for it? I don't have a direct answer. Again, I think it is a lot of just sort of the cultural change and how people address cultural sort of ways to look at results. And
Right.
yeah, for the first question as well, just to quickly say that again, I think it's more about the reproducibility. So if someone has, say, a project that they are doing end to end with results, with sort of proof, I think they would have much stronger evidence for advocating for the results. But students, I think, do not have that power often. So it is definitely about the larger cultural change. But again, please feel free to add reflections. If other people have answers to this, please add in the Fremapad as well.
Great. Thank you so much. This was, I think, a great session and really interesting conversations that came out of this. Gracia, is there anything you want to add to wrap up?
Yeah, so wrapping up, thank you so much, y'all, for coming. For next week, we are going to have a workshop on GitHub. So please come with your GitHub accounts ready. If you don't have an account, just go to github.com and click on sign up. You're going to create your account. And next week is the last week for coaching sessions. So if you want to grab one of your experts to ask them questions, please sign up as soon as possible so we can organize your coaching session next week. That's it. Thank you, Aman. Thank you, Elsa. That was great. Very engaging. See you next
Thank
week.
you. I'm happy to stay back for a couple of minutes if people have any questions or discussions. But yeah, thank you so much for joining.